Okay. So good evening, everyone, and thank you very much indeed for that introduction, Fiona. Yes, I am Lizzie Bird, and I'd like to welcome everyone to the WorkMaze webinar on how to create a CV and a cover letter to market yourself effectively. So I'll be presenting the webinar for this evening with this help of Fiona. So you've just heard her introduce me, and let us move on to talk a little bit about what we're going to be discussing. Beyond the introduction given by Fiona, I just wanted to say that over the past 13 years that I've worked in recruitment, I would estimate that I've not only read over around 10,000 CVs, but I've also made decisions based upon those CVs and cover letters. And I'm very aware that those decisions have, to a degree, impacted the course of somebody's career. Okay, because of that experience, I have some opinions on what makes a good CV and a good cover letter, and what doesn't. And I'd like to share those opinions with you this evening and to provide some tips on what to do, and just as importantly, what not to do. Okay, so as an audience of MBA students, I understand that you're likely to be coming to this webinar with a different set of career objectives. Some of you may be wishing to stay in your employing company, but seeking a promotion, whilst others are possibly looking to move employer and so doing, potentially change industry, function, and possibly location. So what I'd like to do in order to tailor my presentation to the group is to really get an understanding from you regarding your future career ambitions. In order to help me, please could you now turn to the voting buttons on the right-hand side of the screen, and you should see a button in the bottom right corner which has a hand on it. Using this button, please could you raise your hand if you are looking to change your industry in the next couple of years. And if you could do that now, that would be wonderful. Okay. Wonderful. I appreciate everybody's just going through that process. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so looking at the figures, I'm anticipating that about a third of you are looking to change your industry, so thank you very much indeed. Now, could you please raise your hand if you're looking to change function? If you could do that now, that would be great. Thank you. Okay. So, carrying on looking at who will be changing function. Goodness me, just slightly fewer are looking to change function, and I would anticipate that that's probably about a quarter of you looking to change function. And finally, if you could let me know if you're looking to change location, that would also be great. Okay. Wonderful. So I probably have about 20% of you looking to change location. Thank you very much indeed for providing that information. And I will certainly keep that in mind as we go through the presentation, just to make sure that I incorporate some advice for those of you who are looking to change industry, function, and or location. And I appreciate that some of you are looking to change potentially 2 and possibly even 3 of those. So we have an hour planned for this webinar, and I'd like to spend around 40 to 45 minutes or so going through the presentation before leaving a final opportunity for question and answers right at the end of the presentation. You are certainly more than welcome to ask questions as I go through the presentation, and what I plan to do is to address these periodically. I'll give you a little bit of warning when I'm about to give an opportunity for questions. However, I just wanted to assure you that there will be a chance at the end to ask anything that's outstanding. Okay, so I will start the presentation with some general comments on what recruiters are looking for before we move on to some of the more practical information to help you build an effective CV. During the last section of the presentation, I will then turn attention to cover letters, just to provide some advice on how to write these and what to include. All right, so let's start by looking at the purpose of a CV. All right, I'm sure some of you are familiar with the term CV or curriculum vitae, which actually has the Latin phrase which loosely translates as the course of my life. In most cases, your CV is the first communication that you will have with an organization, and it is this which will determine whether or not you're selected for interview. As you write your CV, remember that this is a document for the recruiter. Put yourself in their shoes. It has often been the case that I have been faced with around 250 CVs to read and make a decision upon in one day. Those candidates who have given consideration to how easy a CV is to read and to the formatting immediately make a good impression before I even look at the content. Because of this, it is critical to view your CV as a strategic marketing tool that creates an all-important first impression and gets you that first interview. Okay, one of the challenges in talking about CVs and cover letters is that every recruiter brings their own past experience into any screening process. And with that comes a set of preferences and biases which just cannot be anticipated. And in mentioning biases and preferences, I'm really referring to an individual's reaction to a number of factors which are determined by their experience of life to date. In reviewing a CV, this could include a particular bugbear around spelling, grammar, color on a CV, photographs, font size, font, even whether it's a PDF or a Word document. And I have to confess that I'm no different. My particular irritations are small font with small margins in some attempt to cram as much information onto a page as possible, inconsistent layout and formatting, and a combination of British and US English spelling. Just stick to one or the other. So in order to reduce the impact of these biases, most companies identify a set of criteria against which CVs are to be screened, though it's fair to say that most of these focus on the content of experience rather than the style. I'm currently doing a piece of work, however, with the Financial Services Group, and a large part of their screening criteria is the CV, not just in content of experience, but also in presentation, formatting, spelling, and punctuation. Certainly for those of you in the legal profession, attention to detail is critical, and poor spelling and punctuation in a CV is simply not tolerated by firms in this field, but I can assure you that it is not constrained to the law. Taking the wider view of CVs into account, Workmaze conducted a survey with a number of different recruiters, some of which are agencies and headhunters, such as Korn Ferry, Heidrick & Struggles, and Norman Broadbent, and others of which directly recruit into their organizations, including Accenture, PwC Consulting, and GE Capital. A full list of the companies is shown on the slide. The purpose of the survey was to establish what are the common factors which make up a good CV. So let's have a look at those findings. All right, what I'd like to do is take these key findings in turn. Firstly, companies want to see factual information and not subjective claims. By this, I mean avoid using phrases such as an excellent communicator or an inspirational and first-class leader. Instead, demonstrate that you have excellent communication skills and you are inspirational by providing specific evidence which leads the recruiter to identify for themselves that you are strong in these areas. And we're going to look at how to do this a little bit later in the presentation. Okay, the second bullet point here is to use the past tense. And I have to say that it is particularly irritating to read a CV which keeps changing tense. And although I fully recognize that you may be currently working in a role, I would recommend that you convert all of your tenses to the past, even if it is something that you're currently doing. All right, so with regards to the third point on the slide, there is a tendency for individuals to write one CV and to send it out to all of their target companies, regardless of whether those companies are in the same sector or not. You may find yourself in a position where you're applying to, let's say, consulting and industry. Often, the tailoring of your CV simply means reordering some of the points so that the most relevant stand out, or perhaps changing the language that you use by inserting or removing industry jargon, depending on the role that you're applying for. Okay, the next point is really around bullet points. By far the easiest format for reading a CV is to present it using bullet points, and I would recommend that the text of each bullet point should not exceed 3 lines at the most. This is because recruiters often have a number of CVs to read through, and information just gets lost when it is written in the form of prose. We're going to look at some CVs a little bit later, which I hope will illustrate this point to you. For those of you who wish to apply for specific MBA roles, I know that financing, consulting, and often industry have MBA-specific programs which are designed to bring in high-potential talent to their organization. Then 1 page is standard. Remember, your CV will be up against the CVs which are presented by schools in the form of CV books, and a 1-pager is very much the norm here. Companies reading through the CV books for these programs like to compare like for like, so help them in that process. I'm anticipating, however, that not every one of you will be applying for MBA-specific programs, and if your CV is in response to an advertisement, if it's for an internal job move, whether you're channeling it through an agency for an external job move, or it's just an unsolicited approach to a company, then 2 pages is very much the preferred format, with 3 pages an absolute maximum. Though, to be honest with you, rarely is there a need to make it a 3-page CV, and I'm personally put off by more than 3 pages. I recently received a CV for 8 pages, and I can honestly say that I read the first 2 and gave up. As a summary of what recruiters are generally looking for in a CV, I would just like to also bring out these points. We've already covered that a CV that's accessible to read is of great importance. You want the recruiter to keep on reading, and from personal experience, I read a CV in a pattern. A first scan, just to look at the formatting,
has joined the conference.
Which gives an immediate impression on whether I'm interested in reading the detail. Then a look at the information which stands out in bold. Typically, this is around education and employers. And only then will I start reading the body of the CV. If I haven't been grabbed by that first half page, I skim read the remainder of the CV. When I get to the body of the CV, a focus on success, achievements, and results is also key. Wherever possible, do give specific and quantifiable information to provide evidence of success. Now, this might include information about timelines, budgets, savings made, or increased revenues. I would certainly encourage you to consider using percentages here, if that's appropriate. Okay. We'll talk about competencies again very shortly, but just to ensure that everybody is clear on what I mean by a competency, it is generally regarded as a skill or an ability. Especially for those of you who are wishing to change function and or industry, it is critical that you're really able to highlight your transferable competencies and to help the recruiter understand what you would bring to the role to which you're applying.
Has left the conference.
A key role of the CV to match the skills and competencies listed in the position description with your own experiences. So make it as easy as possible for the recruiter to see why you would be great at the job. Okay, so let's look at some of the competencies in a little bit more detail. And I would just like to flag at this point that at the end of this slide, I'm going to give an opportunity for questions. So if you've got questions that are already starting to emerge, you might want to think about writing those in the Q&A section. So let's look at some competencies. Most recruiters look for 3 broad behavioural competency areas: thinking, doing, and relating. When I talk about thinking, I'm referring to competencies such as creativity, analysis, problem solving, or strategic thinking. Competencies of doing include drive, self-motivation, taking initiative, planning and prioritizing, and organizing. Whilst relating might include communication, teamwork, leadership, working with diversity, and motivating and inspiring others. So on this slide is a list of some of the most common behavioural competencies seen in job advertisements, but this list is certainly not exhaustive. Make sure that you do your research on the role to which you're applying so that you can explicitly match your competencies on your CV with the requirements of the role. Now, I've not included hard skills here, such as knowledge of IT programming software or project management tools, financial derivatives, etc., because there are so many industry-specific knowledge areas. But please don't neglect to include that information as well. Okay, so this concludes the end of this section, what recruiters are looking for in a CV, and we'll soon be moving on to building a CV and some practical tips for doing that. But before we do so, I'd just like to take a pause here to ask whether there are any questions at this stage.
We haven't anything at this point, so if any of you have any particular questions, then I'll let you know. Janet's just actually flagged up a question just saying, will any slides be available after the webinar? Just to let you all know, we will actually be posting a recording of this onto the WorkMaze website in the Open University part, so you will have access to actually watch this again. So hopefully that answers that question. Has anybody else got any more questions before Lizzie moves on? If you want to send them through to host, just so they come through to myself. Okay, Oksana's actually asked, is there a difference in analysing the CVs in different cultures?
Thank you very much indeed for that question, and a very good question indeed. Yes, there is a slight difference, and I'm going to make reference to this a little bit later, but let me address it now. I'm typically talking about CVs for the UK, but also CVs for international organisations worldwide. But culturally there are some differences, and I've actually got a link on the end of this presentation which leads to a very, very useful website which gives some distinct differences between the expectations of CVs, certainly across Europe. So there are some different expectations on what people are expecting to see on a CV. In terms of reviewing CVs, there's not, beyond the norm of what's expected in a country, which is demonstrated on that particular website, it's very much an individual situation and individual biases that come into it. And you really can't determine the cultural elements of that beyond the individual. So with regards to that, I hope that's covered with the last slide that will show you that link to different norms for different countries. But beyond the screening, we will see individuals as individuals. I hope that's helped.
Okay, Mark's asked, aren't these just too generic? Doesn't everybody claim to have these? How do we stand out?
Very good point. So let's hold that question for the time being. I'm hoping that in the next section, we'll really identify how you stand out. There are some limitations, I think, to how you can stand out, but there are some real ways that you can do it, perhaps with a very convincing cover letter and the quality of the information that you're providing in the CV. I think sometimes people try to be a little bit adventurous in trying to stand out, let me put it this way, and I've seen some funny CVs in the past on bright pink paper or scented CVs, all of those types of things. Steer away from the gimmicks and focus on standing out by the content. Okay, but we'll address that as we
has left the conference.
Okay, and just to let you know that Oksana says thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Oksana. Anything
All right,
else?
and that's it for now. No, that's it for now.
Thank you very much. So let's move on to the next section. So we're looking at how to build your CV up here. And what I'd like to say to begin with is that there are really two types of CV that I see as a recruiter. A chronological CV, where business experience is presented in reverse chronological order, and this is far and away the most common format of a CV. There's also a functional CV, where experience is clustered into functions or competencies. this tends to be used by people wishing to completely change function and industry and who really want to focus on their transferable skills, but it's also a form of CV that's more widely used in consulting. Given that the chronological CV is the most popular format, I'm going to focus the majority of my talk on this, but I'm certainly going to make reference to functional CVs. Okay, so let's look at the structure of a CV in more detail. There are a number of different pieces of information which a recruiter is expecting to see on a CV, including name and contact details, education, professional qualifications and relevant training, business experiences, language and nationality. There are other areas that are optional. Extracurricular achievements can be very useful, especially if they provide information about competencies or they explain a period of time which was otherwise unaccounted for, and also profiles and hobbies and interests. Now, one of my clients that I've worked with in the past, which was a client in financial services, commented that they always read a CV starting with the hobbies and the interests. So I'm going to turn this structure on its head, and I'm going to start there. Okay? What follows is an excerpt from the bottom of the second page of a 2-page real CV. All right. So this is listed under additional information. The reason that this financial services company looked at hobbies and interests first is because they felt that they could get a bit more information about a person by looking at about what they did in their spare time. Interestingly, when they saw a series of hobbies such as reading, running, and playing the piano, they interpreted that as a candidate being a loner who was not a team player, and so the CV was put onto the no pile. Now, whether or not I agree with that is immaterial. That is how they screened CVs, and that is how they made the decision. So it is worth thinking about what message you are portraying in your interests and your hobbies. There is nothing more boring to me than seeing a list of vague activities on the interests and hobbies section, by which I mean reading, yoga, traveling, and football. But I would say that about 80% of CVs I have seen have something similar written in this section. Okay? I don't really want to know that you've been to 23 countries in your travels either. In Western Europe in 2012, that's not that unusual. You want to make an impression and to get your CV noticed. So my advice is, if you don't have any interests or hobbies, don't write anything. However, if you have got something to say it with some detail. As an avid reader, you may have collected 80% of Penguin first editions. Okay, you may have gone on 3 yoga retreats in India and started learning to teach. Okay, you may have a handicap of 8 in golf. You might have published some articles or write a blog about a subject that is of great interest to you. Make sure that you list it if that is the case and provide information. So on the CV that you've got in front of you on the slide here, I'm just going to take one point, and we've got running, in brackets, ran the London Marathon in 2011. Okay, as a recruiter, I'm picking up a lot of information from that. I'm assuming that it takes a lot of time and effort to put in that training that is required to run a marathon. Okay, so it's showing me drive, it's showing me dedication, it's showing me somebody that sets themselves challenging goals, it's somebody that follows through on their goals. So a lot of information is contained in that just by the addition of run the London Marathon in 2011. So you can see how really adding this information can help. What I would also say on the interest perspective, for those of you who are looking to change industry, interest can be a really useful place to demonstrate why. So let's take, for example, you were hoping to get into the sports industry and you didn't have experience in the sports industry. I would expect to see a range of activities in your hobbies and interests, and I don't just mean supporting Chelsea Football Club, but real proactive demonstration of a passion for the sports industry. So use this space to your advantage and to really set you apart if you're an industry changer. Okay, looking at the other information that we've got here, languages, the typical references here are native, fluent, business, conversational, and basic. But do be prepared that if you're going to put you're fluent in a language, you could well be asked questions in that language at interview. Okay, so don't oversell yourself on this one. Extracurricular activities and information can also be very important, and many companies are particularly interested in this, just as they are in your interests and hobbies. And much as I've described for that, stuff outside of work can really add to your skills and competencies, your passions and your values. But make something of it here. Don't just put a whole list of activities and extracurricular things that you've done. Provide a little bit more information. Okay, so let's get back to some of the basics now as we move on to some of the more expected information in the form of contact details. Now, I would anticipate that many of you may be questioning how wrong you can go with your personal information and your contact information, but I have to say you would be surprised. Okay, so the first area to consider is the personal information is your name. In my opinion, okay, it is useful to include a salutation if your name is unfamiliar. And the reason that I say this is because as a recruiter, in writing to someone either to reject them or to invite them for interview, it is always preferable for me to write to dear Ms. or Mr. or Doctor or Professor. Okay, it's as simple as that. So if your name is unfamiliar, consider a salutation. Okay, further to the age discrimination laws which came into effect in the UK in 2006, age or date of birth is no longer something which should be included on a CV within the UK. Make sure that your telephone number is one on which you can be called during working hours, or at least one on which a recruiter can leave a confidential message if you're unable to answer a call. For those of you with foreign mobile numbers and those of you who are applying outside of the UK, do make sure that you include your international dialing code. Okay. Again, due potential opportunities for discrimination, do not include information about your religion, marital status, or children. And whilst photos are certainly popular in parts of Europe, Spain, France, and Germany in particular, when applying for a UK role, there is no need to provide a photo of yourself. This is not customary in the UK and again provides potential opportunities for cases of discrimination. All right, and finally, do make sure that your email address is professional. Over the years, I've seen many a comedy email address, including, and I'll try and keep this clean, Le Poulet de la Funk, so I had the funky chicken, and I also had beautiful bouncy Betty. All right, make sure that your address reflects the image that you want to portray. So just some things to consider with that aspect. Let's talk a little bit about education now. Depending on the amount of experience which you have, educational qualifications are likely to take on different emphasis. For example, with only 3 years, they will still be seen as really quite important. But with, let's say, 15 years of experience, it is the skills and competencies you have developed over time which will take precedence. Education and qualifications are typically located either at the start or at the end of the CV. Where you put them is likely to be determined by the message that you want to give. And as a recruiter, I don't really mind where it's positioned as long as it's clear to me. But as a candidate looking to move function, you can position your education to maximum effect. If you've done a module in your MBA which is relevant to the role that you're applying for, you may want to put your education first and provide some information about the module to really highlight this. So, for example, if you want to move from marketing from a background in finance, just by presenting your education with a focus on marketing modules at the start of your CV, you're immediately making an impact that this is what you're interested in and this is what you have some knowledge about. I would caution you, however, not to provide information about all of the modules that you have taken. Keep this focused and only highlight on the elements of the course that make a specific point. If you've received any scholarships, do provide information about these as well as any high rankings that you've achieved on the Dean's List that you might have been placed. Now, with regards to GMAT, some of you may well have taken GMAT. Many industries and companies won't consider GMAT as part of their screening criteria, but there are some industries, such as private equity, investment banking, and strategy consulting, which will. If you have a particularly strong score in your GMAT, do make reference to it on your CV. And by a particularly strong score, I would say 700 or above is worth mentioning. Okay, recruiters often look for good degrees from great schools. If you have a degree from a school which is not so well known, perhaps you'd want to consider explaining your school's ranking or position if you're able to do so. For example, one of the top 3 engineering universities in Europe, according to The Economist, 2008. Professional qualifications are also important to include, but depending on whether you're applying for a role which is relevant to these, you may wish to make more or less of them. Okay, so if you have a background in finance and you want to move into advertising, okay, keep information about your accountancy exams short and sweet. Needless to say, if you want to stay in finance, make something big of them and really provide information about first-time passes and those sorts of things. Okay, don't list every course that you've ever been on. That's frankly a little bit boring and a waste of space. Again, keep focused and bring out ones which are relevant. So the next slide shows an example of a CV where education is listed at the start of the CV. All right, and again, this is an example which has been adapted from a real CV. Personally, I like this structure and formatting because it is clear. There is good spacing which allows the key information to stand out. All right. I would like to bring up an area now which is around profiles, which I mentioned in the structure of this CV is something that's optional. Okay. If you do decide to use a profile, they tend to be located between the contact details and the body of the CV. So let's just have a look at an example of that. And I just want to warn again that I'm going to give an opportunity soon for some questions. All right, so this is an example of a profile that's seen on a CV. Here's a 3-line profile where somebody has explained that they're a change management executive with 10 years of experience working in HSBC in IT. Okay, so I'll just give everybody just a moment to read that through before going on to talk a little bit about profiles and their value. Okay, let me move to the next slide then. So I'm going to be very upfront about this and say that personally I don't much like profiles, and I find that people use them all too readily when they really don't need them. And frankly, I often don't bother reading them on a CV. However, they do have their advantages, and I think that they can be very useful. For those of you who have worked across a number of industries and a number of functions possibly, and where you do not have a clear career path, a well-structured profile can really draw your experiences together and help present that sort of holistic person with a clear set of skills, albeit drawn from varied experiences. If you do decide to write a profile, focus on skills and experience. This is where that subjectivity element really is rife, and people talk about being these excellent leaders and first-class communication skills, very friendly and extremely well organized. So don't fall into this trap. As we saw from the profile on the previous slide, they can also be used to indicate career preferences. If you choose to give an indication of your career preferences on your CV, you really must ensure that you tailor each CV to each job. Unfortunately, I've seen just way too many CVs whilst working in the oil industry from MBA students claiming to have a passion for working in financial services. So don't slip up here. Again, some general advice would be to write your preferences in a cover letter and to keep your CV to experiences and skills rather than motivation. But if a cover letter is specifically not requested, then putting some motivational information on your CV is perfectly acceptable, and the profile would be a place to do this. Okay, so we're going to talk very shortly about the body of the CV, with a focus on business experience. But before we do so, are there any questions about the information that we've covered so far?
Okay, we've got a couple. We've got a question from Peter who's asked, if you have an MBA, would you include your GCSE scores?
Okay, probably not your GCSE scores, to be honest. You might want to make reference to some of your A levels, but it slightly depends on how much experience you've got between any further education and doing your MBA. I would say still some industries are looking for consistency, shall we say, in education. So perhaps if you're applying to the finance industry, perhaps if you're looking at private equity, those sorts of areas, and you've got some strong A-level scores, I would include those on your CV. But if you've got a fair amount of experience, if you're doing your MBA, you probably don't even need your A-level scores, but certainly not GCSE.
Okay, we've got another question from Philippe. What about having an objective after the profile?
An objective after the profile, that's something that I've certainly seen around, and I'm seeing that as a little bit on the sort of motivational side. Again, if you're not using a cover letter, then I would certainly put an objective on your profile if you'd like to do so. However, if you are using a cover letter, I would take it off your CV and put it into your cover letter. So I know that some companies specifically don't want cover letters, some companies do. So you might want to tailor it to what different companies are looking for. But if you're not using a cover letter, yes, you might want to put it there.
Okay, we've got a few more coming through.
Can I take one more now? And then
you can. Let's have a look. Okay, we have a question from Emmanuel.
Mm-hmm.
Which time frame should you focus on in your CV? How long should you go back?
Okay, thank you very much for that question, Emmanuel. In terms of time frame, you really should go back to the point when to the point of schooling, really. I would expect to see some time accounted for between you finishing school and where you're at now. Now, I don't mean that needs to be very much information. Sometimes it just requires a line to give a date and to say traveling, worldwide travel, or whatever it might happen to have been. But as a recruiter, I do just check to see that sort of time has been accounted for in some way, and that is from the point at which you finish your schooling. Okay?
Okay, do you want to take any more, or is that it for now?
I appreciate there are other questions. Let me just move on with this, and then I'll address some of those at the end, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Fiona.
Okay.
Okay, so let's look at some business experience, and this is really where the body of the CV comes to life. This is really where you put your skills and your achievements within the context of your work experience. And I just want to say up front that this can be a very time-consuming process, but putting the effort in really does pay dividends in the end. I would start by brainstorming your achievements and listing these. Be as broad as you can in this, including experiences from your work and from your extracurricular activities. Once you've done that, then analyze each achievement. And in doing so, consider the challenge. What were the actions that you took, and what was the result? If you can, either quantifiable or qualifiable. Then summarize each of these achievements into bullet points. Okay, so you may need more than one bullet point for each achievement to bring out a different action or skill that you used. So we're looking at challenge, action, result, summarized into a bullet point. Okay, I would always encourage you to reword anything from a responsibility into an achievement. Your CV is not a copy of your job description, but instead it is a document which reflects your skills and your achievements. Okay, so I'd like to show you a couple of sections of some CVs now to give you an indication as to how important it is not only to present information clearly, but also to provide the right information in an easily readable format. Okay, so this is the first example that I've got on this slide. And for information, this is based on a real CV. I've changed some of the details to protect the anonymity of the individual, but I've not adjusted the formatting at all. This candidate wants to move into management consulting within the UK, to give it a bit of context there. Okay, so as you're reading that through, I've got several comments that I'd like to make on this CV, and my intention is that by seeing what doesn't work on a CV, you will avoid falling into these pitfalls. So my first comment is that I find the formatting very difficult to read. It is inconsistent and there are some clear errors. For example, if you look at the dates, there is not a consistency in format and there are some spaces missing. Without looking at the detail, I also just find it very wordy and badly spaced, so nothing really stands out to me. The message is lost. Given that this is an application for the UK, I also note that there are a number of states mentioned in the USA. And I just question how relevant this is. I'll be honest, my knowledge of the state abbreviations isn't perhaps what it should be. I don't have time to research them all. This is applying for the UK, and I'm afraid that for me this is just wasted wording. Let's look now at the detail. From January to December 2008, I'm certainly clear of the job title of this individual and that they developed and implemented a 2.5-year technology roadmap, evaluating technologies, vendors, and contracts. However, I have absolutely no context in which I'm reading this. What is the Queensbridge Transit Administration? What was the purpose of the roadmaps? What does successful evaluation mean in this instance? Critical information is missing to allow me to really make sense of this work. From December 05 to December 07, again, I'm confident of the job title, though frankly, I would expect senior to be spelled out. Having read the first line, I pretty much give up on reading this point. It reads as a series of companies, and if I can be bothered to read past these, I can see that there were some real achievements, but the relationship between the achievements and the skills of the candidate isn't clear to me. The third bullet point, which begins simplified complex programs into effective manageable chunks, is a lot more promising to me. However, I'm afraid that the key messages are just being lost again because they are hidden in a prose text. Okay, I would recommend that the candidate breaks this bullet point into smaller ones which highlight skills. For example, I would separate bullet points into managing organizational culture, planning and delivering on time and budget with some details of those, and also working with the client to integrate systems. And perhaps I'd pick up some of the technical elements there. Okay, so that's my view in reading just this excerpt of the CV. Let's also remember that this candidate wants to move into management consulting and to move away from IT consulting. Okay, there is far too much jargon in this CV, and a consulting house would struggle to see this individual beyond a technical consultant based on the language used and how that experience is presented. So let's move on to have a look at another CV. Again, this is an individual who happened to be applying to consulting, and again, no significant changes have been made to the CV. A couple of comments I've got on this one. To start with, I hope you would agree with me that the overall formatting and layout is a lot clearer to read, which keeps me a lot more interested and focused. Dates of employment are obvious, as is the employing company, their activity, and the candidate's job title. I particularly like that this candidate has kept the same format for each of the bullet points. For example, managed, led, initiated, developed, which highlights his transferable skills immediately. Each bullet point is also backed up with specific evidence and, where appropriate, quantifiable information, which allows me to get a picture of his achievements. Okay, so let's look at how to build up some of these bullet points. Okay, so the first bullet point here is responsible for ensuring sales team reach targets. Okay, that's okay, but it doesn't tell me much. All right, many CVs stop at that, but let's look at this second one. I've built it up a little bit, okay, and I firstly put it in the past tense and put in a transferable skill here about management. The problem I'm seeing with this bullet point is that I don't know whether £500,000 in sales is comparatively good or not. So let me develop that one stage further. Managed a team of 3 experienced sales professionals to build and maintain relationships with new and established clients and exceeded challenging targets by 17% over a 12-month period. Okay. It references the competency of managing. It gives the indication of the challenge about maintaining established and building new relationships, and it provides quantifiable outcome, which is given in relative terms. As a recruiter, I would rather see the third bullet point here rather than the first bullet point, but all too often I see the first bullet point. Okay. I did promise I would show you, give some indication about what functional CVs are like. And this is an excerpt from a functional CV. Okay, and as you will see, Instead of presenting information in chronological order and bullet pointing key skills and achievements under each employer, this CV has clustered skills with supporting information underneath each skill set. A functional CV can be very useful if you are planning on making a complete change. Let's say you're moving from being a fashion model to marketing, because it allows you to highlight those transferable skills with far less emphasis on where you actually got those skills. If you do plan on using a functional CV, you must still include your employment history, but this only needs to be a list of employers and dates, and it tends to be located towards the end of the CV. I think I've indicated before that I don't much like functional CVs, and I have to be honest, nor do many recruiters that I speak to, because they're just simply harder to read and to make sense of. However, a well-written functional CV can be a very powerful tool for helping you change career completely. My advice is, if you are staying in the same industry but changing function, or if you're changing industry but staying in the same function, keep with a conventional reverse chronological CV. If you're planning on changing both industry and function, certainly consider using a functional CV. Okay, so let's just look at some final tips as I summarize some CVs here. Okay, tailor your CV for each application. I think we've made that clear. Okay. If you're looking to change function and or industry, avoid using jargon, but do make sure that you keep the technical language if your CV is going to something with the same function or the same industry. Okay. Many firms use data mining software to screen CVs, so ensure that you have clearly stated your skills and competencies on these. They will automatically pick those out. As I mentioned before, getting your CV right is time-consuming. The earlier you start, the more confident you will be about your finished product. A CV is a dynamic document that evolves over time, so do edit and update your CV on a regular basis, whether or not you're in the market. Okay, and link the skills and competencies to what you know the company is looking for. All right. I'm conscious that I did give an opportunity now for any other questions, but looking at the time, I'm going to move on and just cover cover letters, and then we'll come back to questions right at the end. Okay, so the cover letters section is a little bit shorter, but I have to admit that cover letters have probably been the source of the greatest amusement for me when managing screening processes. Just to give you a very brief example of a cover letter I once read, I was recruiting for a management consultancy firm, and I received a CV with a cover letter and an attached document. The attached document was an A3 colour photo montage of the individual's life from their first baby photo through first ballet outfit, first school uniform, a whole series of big life events up to the age of 26, I think they were when they were applying for the role. On the cover letter, the first line of that cover letter read, "I may be small, but I'm perfectly formed." Now, I use this example partly because that was a cover letter that I read probably about 12 years ago, and it certainly stuck with me, and it made an impression and stood out. But one of the problems of this was that it was actually applying for a traditional management consultancy role. Had I been working in advertising or marketing, I probably wouldn't have hesitated to invite this person to interview, but it hit the wrong note for the position that they were applying for. So do be careful with what you're doing there. Okay. Cover letters do provide an opportunity to demonstrate your personality. They give you that chance to stand out and to show your unique selling points and why you're suitable for the role. And they can be really useful for demonstrating motivation, particularly if you're not doing that in your CV and you're looking for a change in career direction. So really quite critical for you career changers. Okay, first thing I'd say is absolutely do your research. Okay, they don't have a specific formula I would talk about with cover letters, but really to do your research, you want to highlight why you're interested in applying for that company. When you're doing your research, don't just copy and paste the homepage from the company's website. Again, I've seen that all too often, but perhaps reference a recent newspaper article that you've read and why that links with you. try and get that salutation right, okay? If you're putting the name of the person that you're replying to, end it with sincerely. If you're writing to dear sir or madam, end it with yours faithfully. Okay. No more than one page. Ensure that you have this correct salutation as I talked about. Consider using bullet points in a cover letter. That's certainly perfectly acceptable. And we're going to talk about the mirror technique very, very shortly. But tailor each cover letter. And I have to say that when I was working at Shell, I cannot tell you how many generic letters I saw mentioning the oil and gas industry and telling me how fantastic BP was. This is a real area where people make that elementary mistake. So let's look at this covering letter technique. If you have the luxury of applying to a job description, use the information and link it to the role. I mentioned at the beginning that recruiters are often pushed for time, so the easier you can make it for me to quickly identify why you would be suitable for the role, the more likely it is that you will go on to the yes pile. And I know it sounds obvious, but I would say that only 10% of cover letters I see actively link the candidate to the job using this form of mirroring technique. So I won't go through them all. You can have a look at them. But over 5 years' experience in the health sector, in your cover letter, make it clear that you've got 6 years' experience as a project manager at Pfizer PLC. Okay, and use this technique. It's incredibly effective. Okay, there are some suggestions for some opening to some cover letters. The first one, just make reference to where you've seen the advertisement. Okay. In the second one, if you found out about a job through networking, certainly reference the person that you've heard about the job through. Okay. And this third and final opening paragraph, okay, having recently read in the Times of your company's plans for expansion, I'm writing to establish whether this will involve an increase in personnel. As a part-time student, I will be completing my MBA through the Open University, and I'm seeking a position to commence in May 2012 that will allow me to make effective use of my marketing and finance skills. Just in those short 5 lines, this candidate is showing me so much about themselves: an active interest in my company, an element of strategic thinking, a personal drive in doing a part-time MBA, their availability, and a high-level outline of their skill areas. So this would persuade me to read on. Okay, the second paragraph, you probably want to talk a little bit about you in some way. So this me section. Why would I as an employer be interested in hiring you? So briefly describe your professional academic qualifications, and if the job was advertised, refer to some of those skills required. Okay, consider the mirroring technique here. The third paragraph I might consider as being we here. Okay, emphasize what you can do for the company, not vice versa. Too many cover letters are all about the me. I want to join you because I will learn and I will develop my skills, and that will put me in a strong position to grow within the industry. Turn that around and really emphasize what you can offer the company. You might want to outline a career goal here, so that's something that was brought up a little bit earlier about objectives. That's something I'd certainly bring here, and incorporate any research that you've done. And the final paragraph, I would put a call to action. So request for interview, advise of availability, and advise of any follow-up call that you'll make. Provide information about salary expectations, but only if it's been requested in a job advertisement. Don't volunteer that unless it's specifically asked for. So that final paragraph also starts to draw in the presentation to a close. Okay, I just want to point out that I'm going to be running another webinar on the 28th of March at 6 p.m., which will really focus on competency-based interviews and how to answer difficult questions at interview. The final slide that I would want to go to before I ask for any further questions is just to point you to a couple of resources that we've got. Firstly, there's the workmaze.com website. And if you'd like to go into that website, you'll find your login details and your password here on this slide. If you go into that section, you will find some example cover letters and some example CVs just for you to reference when you're sitting and designing your documents. I've also got the eurograduate.com website here for those of you who are thinking of applying outside of the UK, just to see what the standard CVs are like outside of the UK within Europe. All right, I think that's all that I have to say for my presentation. We've got a few minutes left, so Fiona, perhaps I can turn to you for any final questions.
Okay, just going back, we've got some previous questions.
Okay.
Louise has asked, what is the best way to present achievements as part of a team? I have some achievements that I can clearly state I led the development of. Others, I was an active member of the team, supported or contributed to, seem very weak as words.
I would tend to agree with you there, and if you can avoid using words like active member of team, supported team, contributed to team, I would really question yourself, well, what did you support with? So when you did support, can you isolate what are the specific things that you did? Because when I read that as a recruiter and somebody says supported team, I'm thinking, okay, did they make the coffee for the team? Or, were they really quite an integral person who organized and facilitated the group of individuals and made sure everybody was there on time and distributed information? What did they actually mean by supported? So yes, I appreciate that it's often difficult when you've worked in teams to really identify what your particular role was, but really try and break it down. So it could be that you facilitated, that you coordinated, that you managed a particular aspect of it, or that you led a particular aspect of it. Really try to use words that give us a specific skill. But I do take the point that it can be difficult at times. Anything else?
We have another question from Mark. Should the CV be addressed to the recruiting manager or the HR department? HR might not understand the detail and dismiss it, but the manager may want to see it.
Okay. So the first thing that I would do is find out who the best person to send your CV is to. Okay, if you've got a small company, let's say a privately held organization that you know is as a boutique firm, interestingly, you might actually want to send it immediately to one of the managing partners because they have recruitment decisions and they might not have a recruitment manager. In that case, just tailor your letter, your cover letter, to indicate that. When I worked for a large organization such as Shell, recruitment just becomes a big enterprise and there's no one specifically that you can write to. And even if you request a name, you're unlikely to find a name for that. So in that, I would just write to Dear Sir, Madam, and I would put it to the recruitment department. But a little bit of research up front should help you to figure out who the best person to send your CV is to. In the absence of anything else, I would put to the recruitment manager, and the chances are that there's a system in their post room which puts it on the desk of the right person. Okay, anything else, Fiona?
Okay, we've got another question from, they're flying in now. We've got another question from Christine Latham. I have had 15 roles which I've compacted into 2 pages with a front page detailing profile, key skills and principal work achievements. With 15 roles, how far back should I go?
Okay, so with 15 roles, I understand that's quite a challenge to put those into a 2-page CV, so well done in doing so. In terms of how far back you should go, the first thing I'd do is, of those 15 roles, I would pick out the most relevant roles to any position that you're applying for the future. If they've all been relevant to one degree or another, then I would focus on the most recent sort of 5 years or so, and I would really build up those bullet points with a lot of information for those skills and those. And with with the remainder, however many there are, let's say 8 roles, you literally just need to account for the time. So you could put the company, and then you could put the name, the title of the role that you had. But I appreciate that you're probably building up on those skills. So typically, focus on the most recent 5 years, unless something that you did, say, 10 years ago is most relevant and you want to build that up.
Okay, and just a final one,
yes.
Just before we finish. Manisha has asked, would you advise to send a hard copy of the CV? I always send electronic copies.
A very good question. And again, it slightly depends on the company, to be perfectly honest. So a lot of companies will request an electronic CV, partly because I mentioned, I think before, that we've got a lot of organizations have data mining software, and they specifically want an electronic CV in order to pick up on some of those words. However, if you're applying to a small boutique firm, to an SME, then I think putting a nicely printed out CV with a cover letter, beautifully printed in a handwritten envelope, gets attention. Let me put it that way. You certainly don't have to do that. It's certainly very acceptable to put your CV electronically through to somebody. But often if you don't know directly who to send it through to, if you don't have the recruitment manager's name or there's not a general recruitment website to send it through to, then I would find somebody within the organisation and possibly just send them a hard copy of your CV.
Okay. And I just wanted to let you know that Alison has just sent a message through saying she just wants to say thank you, excellent presentation, informative and entertaining.
Thank you very much indeed.
So well done.
Okay. So, Fiona, I believe that concludes our time that we've got allocated.
It does. Unfortunately, that's it. Obviously, we'd like to thank all of you for attending and I hope that you all found it beneficial, and we hope to see you at the next one.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.